Hello and welcome to RUSI for this online briefing on NATO's nuclear deterrence. My name's Tom Plant. I'm the Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy here at RUSI. My program runs all sorts of research activities on non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, and of course deterrence, as well as broad WMD and emerging technology issues. It's also the home of the UK Project on Nuclear Issues, which is our next generation initiative, which we held our 10th anniversary conference for last week, which is quite a nice segue into our speaker for today, Jessica Cox, who's previously spoken to our UK pony cadre. We're delighted to have her back. She's head of NATO's Nuclear Policy Directorate and is a very sharp thinker on these difficult issues. So I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Prior to her NATO assignment, as some of you may know, she was a policy analyst in the US government in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, and latterly detailed to the National Security Council as Director for Arms Control, having previously worked for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Today's conversation, though, I think comes at a particularly good time. Many of you will know it's the NATO Defense Ministerial tomorrow and Thursday. This morning, the NATO Secretary General gave a press conference which covered some relevant issues and gave indications of the areas that the ministerial might cover. Now, of course, Jessica won't be prejudging the outcomes of any of those things, but I'm sure she'll speak about relevant issues. One thing that many of you may have seen, though, is that Jessica published an article in NATO Review last week on NATO's nuclear deterrence, which I think really is the stimulus for today's discussion, and essentially argues the relevance of NATO's nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence in general in the contemporary security environment, but devotes quite some attention to arms control issues as well. So just before I hand over to Jessica, a couple of administrative points. We're going to be going for about an hour. Jessica's going to talk for 10 or 15 minutes. Questions are acceptable throughout. If you type them into the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the interface, then we'll be able to see that. And if you see that somebody else has asked the question that you like, you can click on the button to upvote it and it will sort of bubble to the top. Then what I'll do is I'll collate questions and put them to Jessica in bundles that seem to make sense. And as I say, we'll go till about 4, maybe a little after. But with that, I think it's time for me to hand over to Jessica. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today. Yeah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to see you again, Tom, even virtually. And it's lovely to be speaking with colleagues at RUSI again. And I look forward to all of the questions and discussion today on this really important and, as you note, very timely topic for NATO and for our allies. Just a quick administrative note up front, as I have to say, I'm speaking in an official NATO capacity. That means two things. One, as you note, I am not going to kind of prejudge any of the outcomes of the Defense Ministerial this week. And two, I will also not speak on internal US decisions and US government decisions, as I am no longer part of that process and those procedures. So, but I look forward to discussions and hard questions on any number of interesting issues in this area. So let me just start off by giving just a few prepared remarks, and then I'll try to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, so we have plenty of time to get into the substance. First thing, one of the reasons that I drafted the article and wrote the article last week is that I really wanted to provide a perspective on nuclear deterrence that was really NATO-centric. There's been a lot of discussion about US-Russia relations, China's in that mix as well, but often overlooked is the view from NATO and from NATO Europe in particular. So really the framing of the article and the reason that I thought it was important to write is to provide the view from NATO and from allies here in Europe. So there is discussion of, as you note, arms control, strategic arms control, about nuclear disarmament and reductions, and I'm happy to get into all of that. But I really wanted to provide a NATO perspective. And really to really get to the heart of why deterrence is still a topic that we talk about here at NATO, and that we're finding is gaining increasing importance as our security environment is shifting and changing around us. And as most people on this call, I'm sure know, nuclear weapons have been a core component of NATO's overall deterrence and defense since its inception. Our NATO heads of state make clear at almost every opportunity in communiques and strategic guidance documents that NATO is and will remain a nuclear alliance for as long as nuclear weapons exist. But as the director for nuclear policy, the question that I often hear from allies and from others is why? Why is this still important for NATO and for NATO to be a nuclear alliance? And I think, as I mentioned before, that answer really comes back to the security environment and what we need to do to protect the almost 1 billion people that live under the NATO umbrella. As is our mandate here in NATO, we must take steps to make sure that we continue to maintain an effective deterrence in light of these security challenges and continue to ensure that we have a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. So I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about the security environment, because not only was this a part of the article, but it's also very relevant to what defense ministers are going to be considering this week. Most importantly, NATO allies see Russia modernizing its nuclear and missile force in ways that undermine our security and create deep uncertainty over Moscow's intentions. For example, Russia is steadily modernizing its ICBM force, replacing legacy Soviet-era missiles with new multiple warhead missiles in its ICBM force. Additionally, many of Russia's medium range and intermediate range missile systems, including its new Caliber sea-launched cruise missile system, its Iskander missile system, and its new INF range SSC-8 systems, are dual capable missiles. So they're being deployed, can be deployed in either nuclear or conventional modes. And according to credible experts, Russia possesses approximately 2,000 of these non-strategic nuclear weapons, which is significantly more than NATO allies have developed or deployed. Russia's short and intermediate range missile systems can threaten all European NATO capitals, can hold our critical infrastructure at risk, can target both important civilian and military targets from conventional and nuclear strikes, and much of this can be done from within Russian territory. Russia's continued investments in nuclear weapons, including these dual-use systems, raises serious concerns about their ability to manage escalation in a crisis and causes NATO allies to really question Russia's need for this diverse and increasingly large nuclear arsenal. And in addition to these non-strategic systems, in his State of the Nation address in March 2018, President Putin also announced a number of so-called novel nuclear systems. These include Russia's hypersonic missile systems, which there's been quite a bit of press about the development of these capabilities. Last December, Russian officials announced that their Avangard hypersonic missile system had entered operations. They've also been testing their Kinzhal air launch system on naval platforms, as well as their Zircon hypersonic cruise missile system. So these are systems that are not just theoretical, they're in production, and we're seeing them being tested and potentially deployed on systems in the near future. In addition, we've also seen Russia developing its nuclear-powered nuclear cruise missile, what NATO calls the Skyfall system, as we very unfortunately witnessed last summer when we had the nuclear accident in Ninochka. And we have also recently seen press reports that Russia plans to test its underwater unmanned nuclear armed drone, the Poseidon, sometime before the end of this year. But it's not just Russia's capabilities that are concerning, although this laundry list kind of shows you how we view Russia. But it's also Russia's strategic exercises, its large-scale operational deployments of strategic systems, and its nuclear rhetoric that also are causing allies to have concerns. And while we saw Russia's public release of its nuclear use doctrine a few weeks ago, which I think is a very positive step for transparency, that doctrine created about as many questions as it answered about Russia's nuclear use intentions. So that is a short overview of the view from Brussels and the view that we are looking at with concern. And as a nuclear alliance, allies are looking at how we continue to maintain the credibility and effectiveness of our own nuclear deterrent capabilities in light of Russia's advances. And I believe the Secretary General has made very clear on a number of occasions that NATO has no intention to mirror Russia's behavior or their development and deployments of this range and breadth of non-strategic missile systems. We are not going to deploy new intermediate range nuclear armed missile systems in Europe. And we are not seeking a new arms race with Russia. But we do have to consider steps to ensure that the continued effectiveness and credibility of our own systems in light of Russia's developments. And I do want to just talk, as you mentioned it earlier, and note that allies also, in addition to looking at the deterrent side, remain firmly committed to NATO's dual track approach with Russia. And that puts an equal emphasis on dialogue. And that means not just dialogue in the NATO-Russia Council, which NATO allies continue to value as a forum for discussion with Russia, but we also value dialogue between the US and Russia and welcome the renewal of strategic stability talks between those two nations. And we continue to remain fully committed to arms control and to risk reduction as a tool for increasing our security and managing these dynamics. And this is also one of the reasons I wanted to highlight the importance of some of the historical advancements that were made through arms control and the presidential nuclear initiatives in my article in order to demonstrate how arms control, whether that's treaty-based or otherwise, can really change the dynamics and be used to increase our security. So let me just conclude and say that it's in that spirit and with these considerations that defense ministers meet this week. We have a lot on our plate, as the Secretary General outlined this morning, and a lot of issues to consider. But these issues will be in the front and foremost of our ministers as they consider what steps to take next. So let me pause there. So we hopefully have plenty of time for questions, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jessica. I appreciate that. So there's a lot to get into. There's already some questions coming into the chat. So I'll just try and loop some of those together. One thing that we did talk about briefly when we were discussing this was sort of the reaction to the Macron speech in particular, and the role of sort of NATO nuclear weapons. And I know that some analysts had seen a division, if you like, between what Macron had proposed and the sort of the NATO posture, if you like. And I must admit, to me, I wasn't really seeing it, but these are, you know, some quite respected people. And so I wonder if there's something going on behind the scenes that perhaps I should be more worried about. So I wonder, what's your interpretation of what Emmanuel Macron was trying to say with his intervention about how Europeans should look at French nuclear deterrence? I mean, was that aimed at Germany, as people seem to think it was, do you think, or was that aimed more broadly across NATO?
I think that President Macron, in his remarks, was commenting on something that we are seeing more generally. I don't think it was particularly targeted at Germany. You know, the strategic forces of the French are a critical part of NATO's overall deterrence posture. It's not just the U.S. And the U.S. weapons forward deployed in Europe, but it's also the strategic forces of France and the United Kingdom that contribute to nuclear deterrence and nuclear deterrence at NATO. So I do not think that President Macron intended to sow divisions or further divide the alliance. But I do think that what they were trying to highlight was that we need to have a strategic mindset here at NATO, and we needed to continue to look at ways to deepen and strengthen the conversations here about nuclear deterrence and the role and the meaning of nuclear deterrence for NATO more generally. So in my view, this was not something that was intended at all to kind of be a divisive statement, but more to call attention to the continued importance and relevance of nuclear deterrence to all allies throughout the alliance, and particularly offer up the role that France plays in the example that France sets in their own exercises and posture and things like that as a tool to help allies further understand the importance of nuclear deterrence, messaging, signaling, and all of those tools that we have at our disposal.
So it sounds like you see it as broadly additive. One detail, if I might just follow up on, was there seemed to be a suggestion that there might be, just as you mentioned Snowcat there, participation of non-nuclear allies in NATO nuclear exercises. So it seemed that that was offered as well. And is that something else that you might consider additive, or potentially if a NATO ally was trying to decide who to collaborate with, presumably you would want that exercise allocation, as it were, to go to Snowcat, as it were, as opposed to French bilateral. Or presumably more bilateral arrangements. I mean, is that right? Or, I mean, do you see that as additive as well?
So I would say my primary hope is that allies will participate broadly in NATO's nuclear mission, and that includes Snowcat, which is our conventional support to nuclear operations. And we have quite a few allies who contribute conventional capabilities to that mission, that fly, in exercises with all of the allies, and that play quite a big role. We talk about the nuclear mission and burden sharing across all allies as being quite important for not only sharing the political side of the nuclear mission, but also the operational side of the mission. And so, from a big picture standpoint, Snowcat is a very important contribution that many allies make to the nuclear mission and to our operational posture more broadly. That said, we have many bilateral relationships as well. The United States flies with allies quite frequently on a bilateral basis, which contributes to NATO deterrence. And I think, similar bilateral arrangements with the French as well would be additive to the overall nuclear deterrence posture with NATO. So I think all of these things demonstrate the strength that we have, alliance unity and resolve, and contribute to kind of the overall nuclear mission here at NATO.
Very well, thanks very much. So we'll leave that conversation briefly, although I think we will return at least to the German angle of it later. There's a sort of set of questions that have bubbled together on the Q&A, which I'll lump together, which are really about non-strategic nuclear weapons, both Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons, as you mentioned, and NATO non-strategic, or B61 really, weapons, and their relative utility. If I might broadly sum up the questions, essentially saying that what we're seeing from what you put out from Russia is a pretty heavy reliance on these systems for whatever reason that you might want to explain your views on what you think that is, whether there is a real threat there. And then the question of whether, sort of, does NATO actually need to line up against that in some way? Are the B61s actually useful in any meaningful way, or are they really just a political symbol now? That's been quite a key feature, I think, of the debate that I've seen, following the Rolf Mützenich remarks around the nuclear sharing agreement in Germany. And one of the key questions really was what use are these systems anyway? So I think there is a point where actually the threat maybe from Russia is felt but not well analyzed, and the use of the B61s in kind of practical hard security terms as well as political terms is maybe not so discussed. And I wonder if there's anything you could do to clarify that for us.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good set of questions, because I think you're right. It is something that we hear quite a bit, that the B61 is it's not a useful weapon, or it's just this is just a political tool. And from my viewpoint as the director for nuclear policy here at NATO, that's just clearly not the case. We don't have nuclear weapons just to kind of make a political statement. I mean, these are tools of deterrence first and foremost, and we certainly, from a NATO perspective, say that the actual circumstances in which we could contemplate use of these weapons is extremely remote. But that said, they do have operational utility, and they must have operational utility, or else they would not provide an effective deterrent. As I said, we are not going to mirror Russia's capability developments on non-strategic nuclear weapons or its, short and intermediate range missile systems. It's not, it's not what we need to do for the security of NATO and for our posture. But we do have to make sure that our systems, including the B-61, and our delivery systems for that weapon are resilient, that they're survivable, that they can, continue to be effective in the face of Russian aggression. And so those are the types of things that we really focus on. And that includes encouraging our DCA allies like Germany to modernize their DCA aircraft, to make sure that we have effective delivery capabilities. One of the things that I didn't discuss, but Russia has a fairly significant A2AD environment in which we, not just in the nuclear sense, but in a conventional sense in general, look at when we think about the deterrence and defense of NATO. So that's something that we consider as well for the nuclear mission. But this comes back to also why there's such an importance of the conventional support too, because we don't just fly aircraft in isolation. There would be a broader set of activities that are going on and that it would be critical to the success of any nuclear mission. And those are the types of things that we consider here at NATO, is how to make sure that our capabilities are effective. That's a critical part of deterrence, and why that I personally will never say that these capabilities aren't useful and can't be used, because it's just clearly not true. They have to be usable in order to be effective for deterrence. And I think it's, and it's important to be clear that, we don't, we certainly hope that we never have to use them, and that's the point of deterrence. But having an air leg here in Europe, that it's an important tool for signaling, it's an important tool for alliance unity, but it's also an important operational tool that, should we be called upon to respond to a nuclear attack, we would have capabilities to do so that are for the deterrence and restoring deterrence here at NATO. On the kind of Russia non-strategic capabilities, this is something that we discuss quite a bit here at NATO. As I mentioned, Russia's nuclear arsenal is quite significantly larger than NATO's, or the US weapons deployed in NATO, but really NATO writ large, when you consider the French and the Brits as well. And so we start looking at that, regional overmatch that Russia has been developing, and try to think about why does Russia have all these capabilities? Why does it need to maintain this large of an arsenal? I don't think we have any unique or exquisite insights into Russia's purposes and intent. But certainly we see things like their nuclear exercise Grom last year, where they really looked at escalation across a spectrum of nuclear capabilities, from non-strategic nuclear capabilities up through strategic nuclear use. We know that they will seek to dominate the escalation ladder in any potential conflict. And the wide variety of nuclear weapons that they have and range of arsenal will give them a potential advantage vis-a-vis NATO in that regard. And I think some of the reasons that are also legacy reasons as well, right? They had a significant arsenal during the Cold War of these systems, and unlike the United States, and which got rid of all of its non-strategic nuclear weapons except for the B-61s. We didn't see Russia take similar steps at the end of the Cold War. So I think there's really a variety of rationales that are available for us to think about why Russia might want to have this diverse and large of a non-strategic arsenal. But from a NATO perspective, we have to consider all of these intentions, and we have to look at the capabilities in total, and what vulnerabilities we have as a result, and seek to address those vulnerabilities to make sure that we can maintain deterrence, and have capabilities that continue to be effective.
That's actually quite a nice lead into the next batch of questions I wanted to take, which sort of start to talk about that conventional nuclear mixture, right? When you're looking at deterrence in the round. So one of the suggestions is, for example, Russia is obviously much more concerned about NATO conventional capability, particularly where non-nuclear long-range strike might go in the future. Maybe not where it is now, but maybe where the Allied non-nuclear strike capabilities are really quite alarming from a Russian perspective. So there is something interesting here about sort of emphasizing those kinds of capabilities as a non-nuclear deterrent, which bizarrely might stimulate the kinds of fears that you're trying to avoid, if you see what I mean. There's also a sort of question of what's the right kind of balance between nuclear and non-nuclear deterrence. I mean, is this your article and then the Secretary General's press conference this morning? I guess we'll see later this week. But there does seem to be more of an emphasis on nuclear issues kind of in the last couple of years than maybe there had been previously within NATO. Nuclear deterrence issues, I mean, specifically. I wonder if that's a fair analysis, and what you think that NATO can do to kind of get that balance right. It sounds like you feel there's a gap in perhaps conventional, maybe the Secretary General thinks that, but it sounds like you feel like there's some bolstering to do in the nuclear space, at least. So I'm just wondering what that bolstering looks like in a way that maybe is well communicated with Moscow, such that it doesn't arouse the wrong kind of feeling from your perspective.
Sure. So as the Secretary General previewed this morning, this is one of the key issues that we'll be examining in the ministerial. So it will be difficult for me to talk about kind of specific solution sets. But I will say that we have long said here at NATO that our deterrence is a mix of conventional forces, nuclear forces, and missile defense forces, and that has not changed. And we've looked at augmenting and adapting in all of these areas over the last 5 to 6 years, as we've seen a more assertive Russia in the European continent. And so all of those, that broader appropriate mix, as we say in NATO speak, that is what we're looking at right now. And I do think that it's one of the reasons that our nuclear posture can be much less than potentially Russia's, and that we don't have to mirror in the nuclear domain, is because we do look at our broader capability set and making sure that our full mix of capabilities provides an effective deterrence. So deterrence is not just about nuclear; it is about conventional and about the full mix of capabilities that we have. That said, I think over the past few years, there has been an increasing attention on NATO's nuclear deterrence in light of what we've seen Russia doing. And I think that as Russia has increased its nuclear investments, its nuclear arsenal, as we're seeing it develop the capabilities and field the capabilities that it has, that it announced in 2018, as we saw the INF treaty end because of Russia's development of intermediate ground launch cruise missiles. I mean, all of these things have contributed to the discussion here at NATO, and highlighted the continued importance of the nuclear piece of that appropriate mix. And so I think it has drawn attention to the fact that we have to look at our nuclear posture anew, just as we examine our conventional posture and our missile defense capabilities. That being said, I do not foresee any new nuclear deployments by NATO here in Europe. I think we are very much focused on the things that we can do to just bolster our current capabilities, and maintain that effectiveness. We still, very much rely on the strategic nuclear forces of the United States, the UK, and France, as I said earlier, to really provide strategic deterrence. And so we look at, kind of the NATO piece of that as really providing the non-strategic piece, the European regional deterrence piece, and that looks. Then we look at that in the broad mix of capabilities that we have. But there will be, we will change, we will adapt, and that is what we'll see ministers discuss this week. I'll say, I don't anticipate any huge groundbreaking, harken back to kind of 1970s dual track decisions coming out of the discussions this week. But ministers are really considering our security environment and what steps we have to take across the board.
Well, indeed, and the SecGen actually, I think, ruled out this morning new deployments of land-based nuclear missiles, at least in Europe. So I think he was confident enough to say that, at least, which I think is fair enough. Now, one of our questioners has picked up an interesting theme here, which is, of course, we're talking a lot about capabilities, but not too much more about other elements of deterrence. I mean, it's been mentioned that we talk about communication, crisis signaling, risk reduction. I might add to that also how we how we interact with allies on nuclear issues. Our conversation on the B-61 just now, and the kind of general lack of awareness of military utility, or even the questioning of it, which you seem very confident about, and others in Germany seem much less confident about. And obviously you're in a difficult position as regarding sort of briefing out on that, but you feel clearly that there is one. There is something about how we talk to each other about nuclear capabilities, isn't there? And about how we interact with our rivals and potentially, God forbid, our adversaries in future. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about thinking there. I might also pen as a sort of footnote, and you can decide whether to take this or not. I note this morning, Finland, Finnish, Swedish, Australian defense ministers will be dialing into the secure ministerial summit in the next couple of days, which is kind of interesting because obviously, particularly in Northern Europe, that relationship is becoming much closer in recent years. And yet, unlike the nations of NATO, have not signed up over many years to a, quote, nuclear alliance. And in Sweden's case particularly, feel deeply ambivalent about it, given their national debate. So that's kind of an interesting relationship to manage. So I wonder if there's sort of three things there: managing communications with adversaries within an alliance, and then with sort of near alliance, very close partners. I wonder if you can talk about how you deal with nuclear issues in those contexts. I think that would be very interesting.
Absolutely. Well, strategic communications is the reason that I'm here talking to you today, because I do think that we have really stopped talking about these issues very much. And it's one of the things that during my tenure here, we've really tried to change quite significantly, because it's important to have these discussions and to have these debates. I mean, regardless of what what side you fall down on, whether you're a nuclear deterrence hawk or a nuclear abolitionist, I think it's very important to understand the arguments, have critical discussions across these communities, because we're really all focused on the same thing, which is preventing the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that it's really important that we do talk more about the role of deterrence, and not only from a NATO perspective, but much more broadly, and the reason that it's still relevant. Communicating, and I'll kind of go through each of these, your kind of three buckets of people, because I do think that each of those are kind of quite different and different audiences, and ones that we do message to very differently. In general, I think as we were just discussing, the discussions here at NATO and amongst the alliance have increased, and the discussions have gotten much more sophisticated over the last several years as allies have relearned the principles of nuclear deterrence, and why it remains important for NATO's broader deterrence and defense. So I think a lot of what I do and a lot of what my team here does is education. It's educating allies, both here in headquarters, but also in governments, talking about these issues, talking about the security challenges that we face, talking about the capabilities that we have, and the broader capabilities that we have, and why this is still important. So we do a lot of outreach that is at a kind of classified government to governmental level, talking and discussing these issues. Where I think we've been less successful, and I think those have been quite successful, where I think we've been less successful is the public outreach. And I think we've really ceded a lot of the public debate and discussion to, a lot of kind of the ban treaty movement type discussions, where it's really kind of the post Cold War, coming out of the 1990s peace dividend, and President Obama's Prague speech, which I worked on, reducing the role of nuclear weapons for years within the U.S. government. So I feel very strongly that that's a really important goal to have. But at the same time, as often overlooked, that President Obama said, we are unlikely to rid the world of nuclear weapons within any of our lifetimes. And he also, invested in the nuclear modernization program of the United States as a result of that, and thought the continuation of modernization was quite important. And we need to be communicating this message more, and it is something that I try to do. Certainly, the Secretary General, from a NATO perspective, has been communicating much more on this subject as well, as it has kind of regained prominence and importance, and the public narrative is important, because we're not mirroring Russia behavior. We're not, taking drastic or dramatic new steps. But what we are doing is trying to maintain credibility, and part of that is communications, which gets to the kind of how we communicate with our adversaries. The NATO-Russia Council has continued to meet. I think some NATO allies would wish it to meet much more. We're kind of in a standoff right now, where allies have requested a meeting with Russia, and Russia's kind of said, we don't really see the value in this. And to me, that's really unfortunate, because it is one of the channels that we have to talk about these issues, and to exchange views, even if we don't reach agreement or breakthroughs in the relationships. It's important to still have dialogue and to still talk, and I think allies very much have welcomed the continuation of US-Russia discussions. They regularly get briefed when other allies have bilateral conversations with Russia as well. So, in the absence of a NATO-Russia channel, allies continue to reach out and to have discussions with Russia. But we also, it's not just about those sitting down across the table and having a discussion. We also do strategic communications in many other ways. One of that is demonstrating capabilities. It's which is why there is such an emphasis on capabilities. It's exercising. It's our political statements. It's our commitment, and our broad statements that of our commitment to the mission. And so I think that it's those are also ways that we have strategic communications with our adversaries. And adversaries is the wrong word, but the way we communicate to Russia, and the way we signal our deterrence. And finally, with kind of with partner nations, or kind of the ones that we engage with regularly, it's not just Finland and Sweden. We also have discussions with Asian partners as well, who are increasingly looking at nuclear deterrence and nuclear issues in the Asia Pacific region as well, and looking at kind of the dynamics we have in Europe, and the dynamics they have there. So having these conversations with partner nations is also critically important. And even countries like Sweden, which, as you noted, is quite ambivalent about its own views on nuclear deterrence. I mean, it's important for us to have these discussions, not just about nuclear deterrence, but about deterrence in general, and not just about NATO's role, but about our broader broader security environment. And we share views about Russia with our Asian allies. We share views about Russia and, to a lesser extent, China and North Korea. But these are all important discussions for us to have, so we can understand where our partners see their own security concerns, how they see NATO as positively contributing to their own security environment, even if they're not part of the alliance. And so these are ongoing and conversations that we have quite frequently, and that we're trying to do more of from a nuclear perspective.
Okay, so that last point I think is particularly interesting in relation to NATO's conversations with US allies in Asia, basically other recipients of US extended deterrence, who, the US quite strongly argues you don't need forward deployed nuclear weapons for your deterrent. Obviously, they look at Europe and might be forgiven for thinking, well, NATO says it's so essential there, why not for us? So that's quite a difficult thing to deal with. I wonder if you might address that a little in my next set of comments, because there's a couple of questions which talk about NATO's ability, I think, really to adjust, to evolve, to adapt to quite rapidly changing environments. In particular, a post-INF world, a world where new technologies really are disrupting nuclear deterrence as we understand it, notwithstanding the points you make in your article. One of the suggestions that's been put forward, for example, is to think about nuclear sharing differently, that we don't necessarily think about nuclear basing, but sharing is distinct from basing. That's kind of an interesting idea. I want to put on the table, which you will no doubt have read, an article from, I think, the 3rd of June by Michelle Flournoy and Jim Townsend, which talks about some other aspects of nuclear sharing which didn't enter the debate, and which you didn't headline in your article. And I wonder if it's because you agree or disagree, which was essentially the shared risk that an ally takes on by hosting NATO nuclear weapons. There's the burden sharing element, of course, in terms of operation, in terms of deployment, but there's the risk element in terms, presumably, of incentivizing attack in a crisis. That's not something that you emphasized for reasons I can quite clearly understand, but I wondered if that's because you disagree with it, or you think it's less important. So there's sort of a general question about, can we rethink that sharing without basing idea, and more broadly, is NATO in a good spot to adapt itself to this sort of rapidly changing post-INF environment?
So there's a couple of different things embedded in that question, and I'll try to tease them out. First of all, I'll talk about the Flournoy Townsend article, which I welcomed and read with great interest, and agree, I think, with everything in it, including the notion of shared risk. But I think it's maybe even a bit broader than how they portrayed it in the article. We have Russia has been very openly, very publicly stated that any ally with DCA bases or nuclear bases on their territory will be targeted by Russia's nuclear weapons. I mean, they've stated this openly on a number of occasions. So there is an increased risk that our basing nations undertake by having U.S. nuclear weapons on their territory. That said, I don't think not being a basing nation keeps you from being in Russia's nuclear crosshairs. I think that it's, Russia certainly hasn't provided any negative security assurances to the contrary, and I don't think they would, because I think that they have a much broader view of what might be necessary in a crisis or conflict with using their nuclear weapons. So yes, there might be, Russia has been vocal about the fact that those nations will be in the nuclear crosshairs, but I very much think that Germany, for instance, since the article was geared towards them, would be in Russia's nuclear crosshairs anyway, because they are, a huge contributor to alliance security in many different ways and respects, and are at a critical location within Europe. So I don't think that, not contributing to the nuclear mission would take that risk away. But that gets to kind of your second question about sharing and basing. We obviously don't, from a NATO perspective, confirm or deny any locations of where US nuclear weapons might be deployed here in Europe. But I do think that there is a broader discussion to be had about whether these are kind of concepts that that we need to think about anew. And I think, this is probably something that's very ripe for whenever the United States writes another nuclear posture review, but also something that, I think should be on the NATO agenda as well, as we think about the future. And it's not something that we're going to consider this week, but I think as we look towards the future, we're doing a lot of kind of strategic thinking right now about NATO 2030, and starting a number of processes looking at the alliance over the next 10 years and how we need to adapt and evolve. And, I hope that this is one of the things that we can consider in that context about whether we need to rethink all of these different roles and contributions, because it's not just the nuclear role, as we were discussing, either. It's also the conventional support. It's also about thinking about what we'll need in terms of ground defenses and air defenses. I mean, there's a lot that goes into something, the nuclear mission that sounds like, just one little, weapon being dropped in one location, but it's a much more complicated series of responsibilities and roles. And I think we need to be much more open about that, and talk about that much more broadly, because it's not just, a few nations that are contributing, and it's not just a few nations that are risking attack. It is a shared role and shared responsibilities. And I think we need to have different kind of concepts and ways of acknowledging all of those different roles in the nuclear mission, and burden sharing roles more in the broader burden sharing response, kind of lexicon. Asia, Asia is very different than Europe. So I don't want to imply that their security challenges or their environment is the same. And I think we can learn from our Asian allies, just like I think that they learn from us. In particular, I think we have two allies that are Asia Pacific nations as well. So a lot of what we think about, it can't just be centered on the European theater, because we have two allies that are, are bordered by the Pacific Ocean and have a Asia Pacific focus to their own security and strategic policies. And we can't forget that as an alliance. And so it's really important that we understand the security challenges in the Asia Pacific region, that we talk to those partner nations, or the U.S. umbrella nations as well. We have very similar views of the world, and so we have very similar, not just security views, but also just shared values. And so it's important to also talk about the broad shared agenda that we have with our Asia Pacific partner nations. So I don't in any way see a return of U.S. weapons to the Asia Pacific theater, but that's well out of my remit, and certainly would not suggest that is something that NATO should have any business contributing to thinking on that regard, one way or the other. But I do think that we share security risks, and it's important to understand perspectives and to talk about those shared values and shared views. And then finally, just kind of the ability to evolve and emerging technologies. This is kind of almost a whole separate question that I could talk about at length, and I specifically did not put in my article because it's something that I have a big passion about, just completely on a separate, a whole separate discussion. You know, I think here at NATO, we're very much looking at just writ large. We have a huge line of effort looking across the alliance at emerging and disruptive technologies, the implications, the ability for us to capitalize on new and emerging technologies, but also the risks that they pose. And we are doing the same kind of evaluation in the nuclear domain as well. From my perspective, I think the frontline issue that we have to look at is NC3, Nuclear Command and Control and Communications. I think that is a foundational pillar of our capabilities that is potentially at risk from emerging and disruptive technologies, or things like cyber, which is not so emerging, but still the kind of technology that we look at in this space. And we're really looking hard at how we make sure our mission is responsive to future threats and challenges. But I also think that where we have work to do is taking advantage of new technologies as well, and seeing how we can use them beneficially as well. I think there's a lot of people that just look at emerging technology and just say, it's bad. It's, it needs controls. It needs, to be reduce the risks and all that. And there is a lot of work that needs to be done and that we're doing in that area. But I think that there's also a lot of benefits from emerging technology that we need to think about as well. And that's work that I hope will kind of start taking on from a nuclear perspective in the coming year or two. And I would just say, we have to be adaptive here at NATO. I think we know that. And I think we're trying to figure out how to do that in the best and most secure way possible, secure from the alliance perspective. And I think that it's just a really interesting area, and we have so much that we need to do in a very short amount of time. And when we look at the technological advances in cyber and space, but also things like quantum computing, artificial intelligence, all of these things have the ability to really impact how we do our jobs just on a day-to-day basis. And to me, the thing that we need more than anything when we think about emerging tech is start to put these communities together. And that's where I think we really haven't done a very good job, and I hope we'll change that in the future, but bringing together nuclear experts and cyber experts and space experts and AI experts, and start having dialogue across these communities. So we start understanding each other. So we start having conversations that, and start speaking the same language. I think, I'm kind of a nuclear background. I'm a lawyer by training, but, I've been in the nuclear field for a long time. I don't speak cyber. I don't speak space. And so, the nuclear community can't just, stay in our silo, in our nuclear vacuum. We have to be proactive in talking to other communities, understanding the risks, understanding the benefits, and really start having these conversations across domains about how we could mutually contribute to the work that each of these is doing. So like I said, I can write many, many, many more words on that, because I think, I do think that in the nuclear domain in particular, we're a bit behind the curve when it comes to emerging tech. And it is one of the things that I'm really trying to focus on changing as we look to the future.
Well, that's very interesting and encouraging, I think, because I know that there's a lot of research institutes, ours as well, that have been looking at this kind of thing. So I think they would be delighted to hear NATO taking sort of more of an initiative with that. We don't have a tremendous amount of time left, and there are a couple of sort of clusters of questions which I think are worth addressing in particular, not least because your article talks about one and sort of skirts around the other. The first being to do with multilateralization, arms control, things like that. So there's a set of questions which talks about, as you alluded to in your previous answer, the way that NATO thinks or doesn't think really about China, North Korea, etc. There is a school of thought which says, well, at some point in that sort of NATO 2030 vision, you really do need to start thinking about, Chinese as a potential sort of deterrence partner, shall we say, and certainly a strategic communications partner. North Korea you mentioned already. But there's also a sort of more contemporary discussion, isn't there, which is around multilateralization of arms control and the views that you personally or NATO corporately might take on those things. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how you think the NATO-China relationship might evolve or might need to evolve, as it were, and might develop in the coming years. And also your views on sort of, progress in US-Russia arms control and multilateralization thereof, which may or may not include China, may or may not include the UK and France.
Yeah, so let me kind of take those a bit in reverse order. So on the kind of multilateral arms control front, I think from a NATO perspective, we are very much corporately pro-arms control. I think allies very much support the continuation of arms control talks between the US and Russia. Many allies have been very vocal about their views that the US and Russia, their hope that the US and Russia will extend New START. But also very vocal in support of, having arms control that is multilateral and that does include China. I don't know if the Secretary General, I don't think he mentioned it this morning, but he has in remarks over the last several weeks, very vocally called for China to sit down and have discussions with Russia and with the United States on the future of arms control. And I think, all allies think that this is important and that it's good work and very much support those efforts. So, just as a kind of current events, I think we're very much in favor of multilateralism. And that I think is largely because we don't see China as a nuclear competitor, as a nuclear threat to NATO. China's capabilities are not, not about NATO Europe in particular, but they do, they are on a trajectory where they could, over the next decade, potentially change the strategic balance between the United States and Russia, and then China. So I think from a broader strategic stability standpoint, allies are very concerned about not just the future trajectory that Russia is on, which is concerning, but also the future trajectory that China is on. And so from a strategic standpoint, we are watching this very closely and looking at the direction China is going in. But we don't see that China is certainly not intending to lob nuclear weapons our way. I don't think in the European direction, and I don't think we have any view of China as kind of a nuclear deterrence rival at this point from a NATO perspective. But it's really that strategic stability question as we look over the next decade and look at these trajectories, and does that cause the United States to rethink its posture if China significantly increases its arsenal. The France and the United Kingdom have been very clear that they have no intention of relooking their own numbers, and so as we look at the strategic balance, I think that's where this issue really we're really looking at it from a NATO nuclear perspective. And it's why our allies are really hopeful that China will at some point choose to come to the negotiating table, that it will enter into arms control discussions and eventually arms control treaties. And I think it's important for for maintaining that strategic balance. So I do think that that's kind of how we're looking at China right now. And on North Korea, I mean, North Korea may be, as we speak, entering the DMZ from a conventional military standpoint. South Korea is a partner, a NATO partner in the region, and certainly it's a U.S. Ally as well. And so we look at their destabilizing and dangerous actions with a lot of concern. And certainly, this is this is not, again, an issue where we feel, a nuclear deterrence threat from North Korea. But certainly if they're threatening, NATO partners and allies of our allies, that's something that is very concerning, and something that we find very troubling. So, so I think that there's a kind of broader geostrategic view that we have of the nuclear events in the Asia Pacific region that are concerning. And like I said before, allies in general very much support arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. We have a goal of a world without nuclear weapons. And so to the extent that countries like North Korea and China and Russia are increasing their nuclear arsenals, that is directly contradictory from the the trajectory that we hope the world will go in. So I think that kind of covers the big picture pieces of your question. If I left something out, remind me what it was.
Sure. I mean, we don't have a tremendous amount of time left. One thing I did want to push a little on, actually, was New START extension, views on that. Again, something that we've talked about before, and I suspect I know your answer on it, but I would just be interested to get on record what your views are, sort of sequencing and priorities for what we should be thinking about on strategic arms control.
Yeah. So I would say, from the view of, corporately, NATO is not a part of New START, but I think many allies have been very clear that they see New START as tremendously valuable to NATO's security, to maintaining strategic stability, to maintaining strategic constraints on Russia and its nuclear arsenal. And that they would very much appreciate if Russia and the United States would agree to extend it, even while the U.S. and Russia seek a new agreement. I mean, New START can only be extended for up to 5 years. It's not the end state that is out there. And so I think most, if not all, allies see New START as a stepping stone, but very much also want to see a next strategic arms arrangement between the U.S. and Russia and China as well. So it's a both and approach, not an either or approach in the view of most allies.
Well, that is a very good way to handle an unhandleable question. So congratulations. I think the final thing I do want to address, because some people have asked this and been waiting for a while, and I think your conversation about arms control and, articles, the allies' interest, including the nuclear allies as well. I mean, the UK has had a long interest in disarmament, Article 6 of the NPT. I mean, what is NATO doing around the disarmament agenda? Is there anything more that could be done? Could there be something doctrinal, for example? Could NATO do something at the next review conference about explaining, as the US previously did, its thoughts on basically why it constructed the NPR the way it did? Could NATO do a similar sort of thing? I'm just wondering if there's clearly a lot of activity on the deterrence side of things. There's a lot of thinking and private conversation on arms control for good reasons. But on disarmament, NATO's a little quieter. So I wondered if maybe I'm wrong. Please tell me if I am. But I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on what NATO is doing and what it should do.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're right. We're a bit quieter because it's hard to talk about disarmament in a world where so many of our, where our primary strategic competitor is increasing their arsenal, and we see other countries doing similar things. This is not, I should be very clear, this is not my area of responsibility at NATO. So I'll be talking more from a personal standpoint. But we do, as an alliance, remain very committed to the ultimate, first of all, to the NPT, as the institution for seeking and reaching the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons. Allies were coordinating very closely before the NPT review conference was postponed, and will continue to do so once I think it's tentatively rescheduled for January now, depending on how the world events unfold. But we'll continue to do so. I think we do feel that the NPT and the continues to be the most successful nuclear treaty out there, maybe one of the most successful treaties out there in general. Certainly from a broader arms control perspective, it's been quite successful as well. And what we can do, things that we can do as an alliance to bolster the NPT, we are trying to do, including talking about our commitments to arms control and further disarmament when the time is right and when the security environment allows. Corporately, NATO cannot kind of undertake disarmament. That's the role of the actual countries that own nuclear weapons, but it remains a big priority here. And I think the main reason that we don't talk about it publicly more, although I would note, the Secretary General had a big speech in October of last year about NATO's commitment to arms control and disarmament that I would recommend to listeners. From a NATO perspective, we're not a treaty to a party, but what we do is coordinate. We exchange views. We try to develop common positions and advocate for common views, and to try to message those common views publicly. And I think when we do start to get into the run up to the NPT, those themes will start to emerge again from our strategic communications. But there is a fundamental issue that we have right now where, the US, UK, and France are basically kind of static in their nuclear arsenals, and Russia, China, North Korea, and others aren't. And so that is the world that we live in right now. And I think unilateral disarmament is not something that allies think would contribute to the security of the alliance. And I don't expect we'll go in that direction. But I think we are quite vocal that we want to see more progress on disarmament in bolstering the NPT and towards a broader vision of a world without nuclear weapons.
Very good. That's an excellent note to finish on, actually, isn't it, Jessica? It's almost like you've done this before. I really appreciate you coming to join us. And sorry to everybody whose questions we couldn't get to. We got through a tremendous number. And again, Jessica, really appreciate you handling some tough ones, even the ones outside your area, very well. Very glad to have had you with us. And those of you who are listening who haven't managed to read Jessica's article yet, it is worth checking out. And thanks for the nod also to the Secretary General's speech last year. That is also worth examining. So for that, I think that's just about all from us. Again, apologies to those who we didn't get to, but I do hope you've enjoyed the conversation. This event will be available later, I think, on the RUSI YouTube channel. And I know that NATO has also been streaming this as well. So you will be able to watch it back if there's anything you missed. But until then, it's thank you very much from me to you, Jessica, and to everybody else for listening in, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon or morning if you're dialing in from the East Coast in the USA. Au revoir.
Thank you.